Have you ever paused to truly wonder how we can be sure about what we know? I mean, we're constantly inundated with information, right? From scientific stuff to just, everyday things we see. And our minds are remarkably good at making sense of it all. But what's the bedrock of that knowledge? Is it some perfect, unshakable, logical foundation, something absolutely certain? Or is it, well, something far more intricate, maybe more grounded in our actual messy lived experience? Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really transformative piece of philosophy, W.V.O. Quine's famous essay, Epistemology Naturalized. Now, epistemology basically is the study of knowledge itself, its nature, where it comes from, how we justify what we believe, and, what the limits of our understanding might even be. It's not just about what you know personally, but sort of how humanity collectively comes to understand the world, including the foundations of science itself. Our mission today is to unpack Quine's really radical proposal to basically transform this ancient philosophical hunt for absolute certainty into a scientific discipline, one that's grounded in empirical observation, pulling from fields like psychology and linguistics. We're aiming to give you a shortcut, yeah. A concentrated dose of insight into this huge shift in how we think about knowledge, moving us from abstract logic to the surprising reality of human experience.
Yeah, and Quine's genius really was confronting centuries of philosophical tradition head on. He forces us to fundamentally rethink what knowing actually entails and, crucially, how we arrive at it. He steers us away from, let's say, abstract armchair thinking and pushes us towards looking carefully at how you, as a physical human subject, interact with the world and process all that sensory input you're constantly getting. What's really striking is his insistence that we look at knowledge acquisition not as some detached, purely logical puzzle, but as a natural, observable phenomena, something that can, and he argues, should be studied empirically, just like any other biological or cognitive process.
Okay, so let's break that down because that sounds like a massive shift. For centuries, right, and especially in the early 20th century, there was this grand project in philosophy, almost utopian, to build all knowledge, particularly math, on a foundation so solid it was, well, unbreakable pure logic. People like Frege and Russell, huge names in the foundations of math, were convinced they could reduce all of mathematics just to logic and set theory. Their hope, as I understand it, was that this would give mathematical truths this: firmness and obviousness. They pictured a world where you could boil down all the obscure concepts to clearer ones, maximizing clarity and getting absolute unquestionable certainty. It sounds like the ultimate quest for intellectual purity.
Oh, absolutely. The ambition was truly monumental. I mean, just imagine trying to define every single concept in the vast landscape of mathematics using only a tiny, carefully chosen set of basic, logical, and set theoretic terms. And then the idea was to translate all mathematical theorems into these fundamental terms. From there, the belief was you could derive every single theorem from just a handful of obvious truths using individually obvious steps. The underlying conviction was pretty profound. If math truths could all be shown to come from logic truths, then the absolute certainty we associate with logic would just transfer right over to mathematics.
Okay, makes sense.
But then the critical question popped up. What happens when the very tools you hoped would give you this absolute certainty, logic, and set theory actually reveal their own limitations?
And that's exactly what happened, wasn't it? This grand plan, this complete, certain reduction of math to logic, it was, as the essay says, denied. The quest for certainty hit a wall. And it wasn't a small bump, right?
Not at all. This disappointment, epistemologically, as Quine calls it, was a huge blow when this ambitious reduction just didn't fully work out. A pivotal, almost earth-shattering moment that really highlighted the limits of this foundationalist approach was the work of Kurt Gödel. In the early 1930s, his incompleteness theorems just landed like a bombshell. They showed definitively that no consistent axiom system can cover mathematics, even when we renounce self-evidence.
Wait, hang on. So this wasn't just some obscure mathematical puzzle. This was something much deeper, affecting the whole project.
Absolutely. It was a crisis, really, a shattering of that bedrock certainty philosophers and mathematicians were hunting for. Imagine trying to build this perfect, logical, self-contained system for all knowledge, this grand structure of truth. Gödel basically showed that fundamentally you can never quite finish building it. He exposed an inherent, unavoidable limit. Even if you start with what seem like perfectly self-evident truths and proceed with flawless logic, you still can't capture the entirety of mathematics within one single, consistent axiomatic system. There will always be true statements within that system that you actually can't prove using only the rules of that system.
Yeah.
And you can't even prove the system's own consistency from within itself. So sure, mathematics remains mathematically and philosophically fascinating. definitely. But Gödel's work made it painfully clear that it does not reveal the ground of mathematical knowledge in the way they'd hoped, nor does it show how mathematical certainty is possible in that absolute foundational sense. So that dream of reducing all mathematical truths to logic truths and getting that unbreakable certainty, well, it turned out to be unattainable. It forced a really radical rethink about what knowing could even mean.
That's a pretty humbling realization, even for logic itself. But the philosophical search for certainty didn't just stop there. A parallel struggle was happening with natural knowledge, our understanding of the physical world around us. This is the knowledge we usually think of as rooted in sense experience. And here, epistemology often talks about a helpful split, or a bifurcation. There's the conceptual side, dealing with concepts and meaning, and the doctrinal side, dealing with truth and belief.
Right, and what's really illuminating here is how David Hume, centuries before Quine, really put his finger on the huge limitations of grounding knowledge just in immediate sensory experience. On the conceptual side, Hume took what Quine calls a bold and simple approach. He basically identified physical bodies like, say, an apple with sense impressions. For Hume, you don't directly experience a material apple as one single lasting thing. Instead, what you get is a stream of many fleeting sense impressions. The specific redness right now, the crispness when you bite, the particular smell. Each is a distinct momentary impression.
Okay, I think I follow. So it's like a movie made of individual frames.
Kind of, yeah. And the huge challenge then becomes, how do you justify the notion of its being the same apple on one occasion and another, when all you really have are these transient individual impressions? How do we build up the idea of a stable, enduring object from such a shifting, fragmented sensory stream? This perfectly illustrates the massive problem of getting from immediate, fleeting sensory input to the idea of lasting objects. And this puzzle, this challenge of moving from single observations to general truths about the world, it just kept haunting epistemology.
So Hume found himself in a really tough spot, especially on that doctrinal side, justifying our knowledge of truths about nature.
Yeah.
He openly talked about despair because he couldn't figure out how general statements, like predictions about the future based on past experience, could gain any real certainty just from those immediate impressions. Like, how could you be absolutely sure the sun would rise tomorrow just because it always had before, if your knowledge was built only on past individual impressions? Hume couldn't see a logical bridge, right?
Sure. Exactly. He saw no logical or empirical way to jump from this always happened to this will certainly happen.
Yeah.
He acknowledged the psychological habit of expectation, sure, but he couldn't find a rational justification for it. It was a pretty devastating insight for traditional empiricism.
Right. So if we can't define concepts by simply pointing to one sense impression, how do we define them?
Well, that brings us to another key challenge. In early American philosophy, thinkers like Alexander Bryan Johnson, writing way back in 1836, sort of echoed Hume on the conceptual side. He suggested things like the word iron names an associated sight and feel. Meaning was tied directly to the specific sensory experience. But a crucial step forward, offering a different path, came from Jeremy Bentham. He recognized what he called contextual definition, or paraphrase. Instead of defining a single word in isolation, Bentham suggested we explain a term by showing how to translate whole sentences that contain that term.
Okay. That's subtle but feels like a big shift. So instead of saying iron is the specific sight and feel, you'd understand iron by seeing how it works in a whole sentence, like the iron bar is heavy or iron rusts. The meaning comes from the context.
Precisely. This approach ceased to be the only conceivable way of making sense of talk about physical bodies based only on impressions, because it moved beyond just identifying a word with one isolated impression. It allowed for a more complex relational way to think about meaning. And actually, this idea of contextual definition turned out to be indispensable for huge developments later in the foundations of mathematics. Think Frege, think Russell's famous doctrine of singular descriptions as incomplete symbols.
Right, like defining the present king of France by how the whole sentence works logically, even though there isn't one.
Exactly. They showed how complex statements could be understood by translating them into more basic logical structures rather than trying to define every single term as referring to something directly. But here's the catch. While this method was unassailable logically within math, applying that same kind of contextual definition to define physical bodies purely in terms of sense impressions could be, as Quine puts it, a drastic ontological move.
Meaning, what does ontological move mean here?
It means a significant, maybe problematic shift in our understanding of what fundamentally exists.
Yeah.
If you try to define, say, an apple only by how sentences about its sensory impressions work, you risk kind of
dissolving its physical reality. It could reduce our understanding of concrete object, something you touch and see, into something more like an abstract mathematical concept.
Yeah.
It felt like a powerful technical trick for logic, but maybe at the philosophical cost of losing our intuitive grasp of what a physical thing is. It could lead to an abstract ontology of mathematics rather than a robust understanding of the physical world.
Okay, so after Hume's deep skepticism and these attempts at contextual definition, the search for a solid foundation for knowledge kept going. And then came Rudolf Carnap with his huge work, The Logical Construction of the World, back in 1928. What was he attempting there? It sounds like a massive undertaking.
Oh, it was. To put it in the bigger picture, Carnap's Aufbau was this epic intellectual effort to satisfy that deep philosophical hunger for certainty. In many ways, it was continuing that Cartesian quest for certainty, but now in the empirical realm. His main goal was to account for the external world as a logical construct of sense data. He literally tried to show how you could rigorously translate all sentences about the world in terms of sense data or observation, plus logic and set theory. It was an incredibly detailed attempt to find a firmly logical way to ground natural science and, crucially, to endow the truths of nature with the full authority of immediate experience. He really thought he could put empirical knowledge on an absolutely certain logical footing, finally solving the problem Hume had despaired over.
That ambition sounds almost overwhelming. So what happened? What did Carnap learn that eventually pushed him away from that initial quest for absolute certainty? It feels like he hit a similar wall, like the mathematicians trying to reduce everything to logic.
Yeah, it does raise the question, why abandon such a massive project? Despite the incredible effort, Carnap eventually despaired of pulling off such a complete reduction, certainly by 1936. The hopelessness of grounding natural science truths in a strictly logical, absolutely certain way became clear. He came to see two good reasons for giving up the pursuit of absolute certainty in that strict way. First, the goal should maybe shift from proving certainty to simply eliciting and clarifying the sensory evidence for science. Basically, figuring out what sensory info we actually rely on, not proving its ultimate certainty. Second, and this is key, he realized that the inferential steps you need to take to get from immediate sensory evidence to broader scientific theories and doctrines, the generalizations, well, those steps must fall short of certainty. There's always an deductive leap, a degree of uncertainty involved in going from specific observations to general laws.
So the focus shifted from proving certainty to just clarifying the empirical basis. That's a really big change in direction.
Exactly. And this shift led to what he still considered two cardinal tenets of empiricism, even after the Aufbau project changed shape. First, whatever evidence there is for science must rest ultimately on sensory evidence. All knowledge of the world at its root traces back to our senses. And second, all inculcation of meanings of words must rest ultimately on sensory evidence. Even the language we use, the meanings of our words, are fundamentally rooted in shared sensory experience. Philosophers, including Carnap later on, started seeing that kind of rational reconstruction, like his attempt to logically build the world from sense data was maybe more like a fictitious history.
Fictitious history, meaning?
Meaning it described how we could, in theory, construct knowledge logically, rather than how knowledge is actually generated by real humans interacting with a complex world. It was like an ideal blueprint, not a description of the actual building process.
Okay, this brings us right to Quine, doesn't it? After this whole journey hitting the limits of logic with Gödel, wrestling with sense data with Hume, seeing Carnap's heroic but modified attempt, Quine steps in. And he basically says, look, forget this centuries-long search for a perfect external foundation for knowledge. Let's just make epistemology a branch of science itself, specifically psychology. That feels like a huge pivot. Why psychology?
Yeah, it's a profound reorientation of the whole field. Quine argues that the traditional epistemologist's goal, trying to validate the grounds of science from some outside superior philosophical viewpoint, actually defeats his purpose by using psychology or other empirical science in the validation. In simpler terms, if you're trying to prove the absolute certainty of science by using scientific methods like studying human cognition, which psychology does, you're kind of reasoning in a circle. It doesn't give you that external independent justification traditional philosophy was looking for.
I see. So you can't use the tools you're trying to validate to do the validating.
Precisely. So instead, Quine says we should stop dreaming of deducing science from observations in some perfectly logical foundational way. He suggests we simply try to understand the link between observation and science, using all the available information, including that provided by the very science whose link with observation we are seeking to understand.
It is circular, as you said, but for Quine, it's a deeply liberating circle.
Liberating how? Because it lets us actually use the tools we have, even if it means accepting some circularity, instead of getting stuck searching for a perfect foundation that might not even exist. It's about working within reality.
Exactly. The goal isn't justifying knowledge via some impossible rational reconstruction anymore. With this shift, that traditional philosophical demand for absolute conscious awareness of how we build knowledge, it ceased to be demanded when we gave up trying to justify our knowledge of the external world by rational reconstruction. The focus moves. What counts as observation now can be settled in terms of the stimulation of sensory receptors. Quine calls this a conspicuous fall from those high ideals of absolute certainty. It means we turn the scientific lens on ourselves. We observe the observer. We study the human subject as a physical object, like studying physics or physiology. The old quest for external justification gets replaced by an internal, empirical study of how we, as biological beings, build our view of the world.
That's a fundamental change from grounding knowledge logically to studying its acquisition empirically. So what does this naturalized epistemology actually do then? What's the new focus, if it's part of psychology?
Right, which is the key question. What does it do? It's not trying to prove knowledge is valid from first principles or provide that grand rational reconstruction. Instead, the new epistemology shifts focus entirely. It aims to describe how our picture of the three-dimensional external world and its history emerges as an output from what is actually a surprisingly meager input, basically, the patterns of energy hitting our sensory receptors. It specifically studies the relation between the meager input and the torrential output, how we construct this vast, complex understanding of the world from relatively sparse, raw sensory data. This new psychological setting means we can now make free use of empirical psychology and other sciences to really understand the mechanisms of human knowledge acquisition. Now, Quine concedes the old containment of epistemology within philosophy remains valid too in its way. Philosophical questions about knowledge don't just disappear. But the new enterprise fully embraces the resources of natural science, especially psychology, to understand how we actually come to know things. It's pragmatic, empirical, looking at the actual process, not just a logical ideal.
Okay, so if we're giving up on absolute certainty, what's the new foundation? What's the reliable basis for knowledge in this naturalized picture? Quine talks about observation sentences. What are those exactly, and why are they so important?
Yeah, what really stands out is how Quine grounds knowledge in something tangible and public, shared sensory experience. He hammers home that core empiricist principle. Whatever evidence there is for science must rest ultimately on sensory evidence. He puts it very starkly. The stimulation of his sensory receptors is all the evidence anybody has had to go on ultimately in arriving at his picture of the world. That's the bedrock for the naturalized view. It's the irreducible starting point. An observation sentence, then, is a central concept here. Quine is careful to say he's not talking about subjective feelings or private gestalten, those holistic perceptions psychologists might discuss. He's focused on the stimulation of sensory receptors, which is crucially an observable public thing.
So it's not about my private feeling of red, which might be unique to me, but about the specific light waves hitting my retina, which presumably hit yours similarly if we're looking at the same thing. It's about the public side.
Precisely. A sentence counts as an observation sentence if two main things are true. First, all verdicts on it depend on present sensory stimulation and on no stored information beyond what goes into understanding the sentence. You don't need complex theories or memories. It's about the immediate here and now. Second, and this is absolutely critical, it's one on which all speakers of the language give the same verdict given the same concurrent stimulation. Meaning, if you and I are both looking at rain falling, everyone who speaks the language and is having that same sensory experience would reliably agree on the truth of the sentence. It's raining. Think of simple things. The light is green. That's a dog. Under the right conditions, everyone observing agrees. This makes them profoundly intersubjective. They allow for intersubjective agreement under agreeing stimulation. This shared agreement, based directly on shared sensory input, becomes the foundation. Not just for science, it acts as the intersubjective tribunal of scientific hypotheses, but also for how we even learn language and meaning. It's the impartial and objective source of evidence for science. It represents the sensory periphery of the body scientific, the minimal verifiable aggregate, with an empirical content all its own. For Quine, the observation sentence is truly the cornerstone of semantics. It's fundamental because it's where language meets the publicly shared world.
Okay, that makes sense. But it immediately makes me think, how do we make sure these observation sentences aren't just subjective, even if tied to receptors? It sounds like the role of the community, the language users, is absolutely critical here.
It is. You've nailed it.
The community-wide acceptance is key. It's not just about one person's senses in isolation. It's about a consistent, shared response within a linguistic community. It's this communal checking, this collective agreement on what counts as a reliable observation, that shifts us from purely private experiences to a common, verifiable ground for knowledge. Now, the level of general fluency or shared understanding can vary, right? What counts as an observation sentence for particle physicists looking at detector readings might be very different from what counts for you and me looking at the weather. Studies can even look at what sentences work for specialists versus the general community. But the core idea holds. Shared responses to sensory stimulation make these sentences objective enough to be reliable evidence. And this naturally means studying observation sentences becomes part of the empirical study of language in a community, a scientific question itself.
This strong link between observation sentences, sensory experience, and community agreement naturally leads us straight to language itself. How does Quine see language fitting into this whole naturalized picture? And what does it mean for our understanding of meaning?
Yeah, connecting to the bigger picture, Quine argues really strongly that language is socially inculcated and controlled by external stimuli. I mean, just think about how a child learns language. They don't start with built-in concepts. They learn words and sentences by pairing external stimuli sites, sounds, touches with their own responses, or with how adults react and explain things. This empirical interactive learning process means that meaning is necessarily empirical meaning. Fundamentally, it rests on external stimuli. The words we use, the concepts they represent, they aren't these abstract, perfect ideas floating somewhere. They are shaped by our shared sensory interactions and how our community uses language in response to those stimuli. This fits perfectly with naturalized epistemology, right? It ties language, the very tool of our thought, directly to our sensory engagement with the world and our social environment. It puts the study of language firmly within the natural sciences.
Okay, but this idea of language being so tied to empirical experience leads Quine to something called the indeterminacy of translation. That sounds pretty heavy, maybe even a bit unsettling. What does it mean for how we understand meaning? And why was it such a problem for earlier ideas, like those of the Vienna Circle?
Right. What's really fascinating, and maybe unsettling as you say, is this concept of the indeterminacy of translation of theoretical sentences. It's the radical idea that you could have many different individually translating ways of translating sentences or even whole theories from one language or conceptual scheme to another, and all of them could still deliver the exact same empirical implications for the theory as a whole.
Wait, how does that work?
Imagine trying to translate, say, a complex physics theory into a completely alien language. Quine suggests that even if you have two vastly different translations, if both lead to precisely the same observable predictions, the same experimental outcomes, there might be no single, objectively correct translation beyond those shared empirical consequences. This implies that, for theoretical sentences at least, the meaning of a sentence turns purely on what would count as evidence for its truth. If two different theoretical ways of talking have the exact same observable implications, then for Quine, there's no deeper hidden meaning that distinguishes them. The meaning is its empirical consequences, full stop.
So it's like saying if two different maps always get you to the same place, any difference in how they draw the rivers or mountains beyond that practical outcome becomes, well, meaningless. The meaning is the empirical result.
That's a good way to put it. And this problem of indeterminacy would appear to be inescapable, according to Quine. For him, it starkly shows the bankruptcy of epistemology in its old foundationalist form. It challenges the very idea of a fixed, absolute meaning existing separately from observation. The logical positivists, the Vienna Circle, they espoused a verification theory of meaning. Meaning is the method of verification, usually observation. But Quine argues they did not take it seriously enough, or fully grasp this irreducibility. They ultimately despaired of translating everything into observational and logical mathematical terms, partly because they couldn't overcome this indeterminacy. For Quine, it means chasing the true meaning of a theoretical sentence beyond its observable evidence is like chasing a ghost. It raises huge questions for any epistemology trying to reduce all meaning to direct observation, because it shows even observation-based meaning has these unavoidable limits.
Wow, that's a really profound, maybe Yeah, unsettling implication for how we think about truth and meaning. So, bringing it all together, what are the big takeaways for us, the listeners, from this massive shift Quine proposes? It sounds like he's really pushing us to see studying knowledge not as this grand, abstract, philosophical thing detached from reality, but as something much closer to empirical science itself. What does that mean for how we approach understanding the world day to day?
Yeah, connecting to the big picture, Quine's final conclusion is that epistemology simply falls into place as a chapter of psychology and hence of natural science. That's a radical redefinition. Instead of being a separate foundational discipline standing outside science to judge it, epistemology now studies a natural phenomenon, namely a physical human subject. In this view, the human subject is accorded a certain experimentally controlled input, certain patterns of irradiation in assorted frequencies, which is just a fancy way of saying the sensory data they get from the world. The study then looks at how this meager input somehow delivers as output a description of the three-dimensional external world and its history, the incredibly rich knowledge we construct. This new psychological setting means we can now make free use of empirical psychology, cognitive science, linguistics, all of it, to understand how we build knowledge. Quine is basically saying the best, most honest way to understand how we know things is to turn the tools of science on ourselves, observe the observer. It means epistemology draws on these empirical fields, moving from detached philosophy to engaged scientific investigation of how the human mind actually functions to create knowledge.
Okay, but this approach, it might sound a bit circular to some people, right? If epistemology is now part of science, but science itself is what epistemology studies, aren't we just going around in circles? Is it really progress or just an infinite loop we're stuck in?
That's a really important concern, and it's where Quine's naturalism is quite distinct. He argues it's not a vicious, pointless circle, but what he calls reciprocal containment, a virtuous circle, a productive loop. Think of it maybe like this. Imagine epistemology is studying how a complex engine works. Traditional philosophy tried to stand outside the engine to judge its design and prove it works perfectly from some higher viewpoint. Quine says, no, epistemology is part of the engine, maybe a critical gear, the cognitive science bits within the bigger machine of natural science. And crucially, the tools within that engine science itself, its methods, its findings, are exactly what we use to study that gear, that process of knowing.
Ah, okay, so it's self-study using its own tools.
Exactly. So epistemology is contained within science, as psychology. But at the same time, science is contained within epistemology, because how we understand and validate scientific theories relies on our epistemological insights about how knowledge works. It's this reciprocal containment, a continuous self-correcting feedback loop, not a linear path from some absolute foundation. It's really an affirmation of the scientific method itself, but applied to the very act of knowing. It acknowledges that our knowledge, including science, is built by human subjects interacting with sensory input within a community. It's pragmatic, always refining itself.
So what kicked off as this grand, centuries-long philosophical quest for absolute certainty via logic and math then passed through Hume's deep skepticism and Carnap's incredibly ambitious, though ultimately modified, project. It finally led Quine to this really radical vision. He invites us to give up that dream of deducing science from observations in some perfect, non-empirical way. Instead, he pushes us to see epistemology itself as just part of natural science, a chapter of psychology. This fundamentally changes the questions we ask about knowledge, right? Shifting from abstract justification to engaged, empirical investigation.
Absolutely. This deep dive really shows us that knowledge isn't built on some ethereal, unshakable bedrock of pure reason or logic. It's grounded in the messy but remarkably effective interplay of our sensory experience, our language shaped by interactions, and the collective agreement of our community. It's a powerful shift that grounds these big abstract questions about knowledge in the concrete reality of how we as biological and social humans interact with and interpret the world. It pushes us to see studying knowledge not as some lonely philosophical exercise, but as an ongoing dynamic scientific project, always refining itself.
So maybe the next time you encounter a new piece of information or find yourself wrestling with a complex idea, a scientific claim, a news report, even a personal belief, maybe pause and consider Quine's challenge. Instead of hunting for some perfect, undeniable, absolute truth or a foundation that might not even be there, ask yourself, what are the sensory experiences, the observations underpinning this? How is this knowledge grounded in things we can actually, check, ideally together? And maybe how do we as a community come to agree on what counts as knowing, even if absolute certainty is always just out of reach?
Yeah, and this invites you to think. If our entire understanding of the world, from simple observations to complex theories, is ultimately rooted, as Quine suggests, in the stimulation of our senses and the shared conventions of our language community. What does that imply about the limits of truth itself? And how does it maybe reshape our appreciation for shared, empirical experience in building knowledge together? It suggests the quest for knowledge isn't some solitary journey towards an absolute endpoint, but a deeply empirical, social, and continuous process, driven by our active engagement with the world.